In this lecture, we'll consider the forces of supply and demand and see how they impact the market for foreign exchange. In 2003, the country of Iceland experienced a unique event. 3 of its largest banks were privatized, and they immediately set about expanding their asset base and raising additional assets, both within Iceland and from abroad. In particular, they borrowed not only from other banks, but they began investing actually in foreign assets, primarily in Great Britain and the United States. In fact, these newly privatized banks in Iceland borrowed as much as they could, as fast as they could, and used that money to buy as much as they could. So this was in 2003. By 2006, it was becoming difficult for the Icelandic banks to borrow and raise capital within Iceland. One of the reasons for this was most Icelanders had already invested most of their wealth or deposited most of their wealth in these Icelandic banks. So these Icelandic banks began opening up for and accepting internet deposits, essentially attracting and borrowing money from overseas investors. Most of these investors were from Great Britain, and they were attracted by the very high interest rates offered by the Icelandic banks. So the banks essentially is engaged in a strategy of attracting overseas money from Great Britain. This was because it was difficult for them to continue borrowing, but they wanted to continue expanding their asset base. And so they borrowed this money from British residents, offering interest rates anywhere from 12 to 15% on deposits, compared to the 3 to 4% rate that was being offered by most UK-based banks. So it's not difficult to understand why these British depositors were interested in moving their money into the Icelandic banks. This higher interest rate was the primary tool the Icelandic banks used to attract money from Great Britain to Iceland. And this is one of the first fundamental and important trends that we need to keep our eye on, is that there was a lot of money flowing from Great Britain into Iceland during this 2003 to 2006 period. The idea here from an economic standpoint that is most important is that the consumers in Great Britain were selling their pounds and buying krona. That is how an economist describes the process of converting British pounds into Icelandic krona. So keep that idea, selling pounds and buying krona, in the back of your mind. That enabled them, the British depositors, to then put their kronas into the Icelandic banks. All right, this trend continued and actually took on several different forms. The key idea, though, in this first trend is that there was a lot of British money flowing into Iceland. The Icelanders also began to facilitate this effect by borrowing money in Great Britain at very low interest rates, and then taking that borrowed money, so they'd go to Barclays Bank, say in London, and take out a loan in British pounds, and then immediately convert those pounds into krona so that they could spend them. We would say that they were selling their borrowed pounds and buying krona. The problem is, Iceland is a very small country. It has only about 300,000 people in total and only a relatively few domestic industries, so it's not hard to imagine that fairly quickly these newly wealthy Icelanders ran out of domestic goods to buy. That brings us to our second big trend. The domestic consumption spree that accompanied the rise and prosperity of these newly privatized banks very quickly exhausted the supply of domestically produced goods. And so the second big trend, which was exactly the opposite of the first big trend, was that we also during this time saw a lot of Icelandic money flowing back to Britain. The reason for this was that Icelanders, in their desire to spend their newly found wealth, started consuming many import goods. And the main import market for Iceland is goods coming from Great Britain. And so in order to buy, say, a Land Rover produced in Great Britain, they had to sell their Icelandic krona and buy pounds. So we had a second big trend that was exactly the opposite of the first big trend, the second trend being money was flowing from Iceland back into Great Britain. Schemes will prevent bank runs or prevent bank collapses, and this is true in most of the developed world. But one of the things that happened towards the end of 2006 and early 2007 was that investors and depositors collectively came to the realization that Iceland's deposit guarantees, the amount of money in the Icelandic banks, were actually several times larger than the Icelandic central bank's ability to backstop or repay. In other words, the Icelandic banks weren't too big to fail, they were too big to save. And when investors and depositors came to this collective realization, particularly overseas British investors, they became concerned. They became concerned, one, with the realization that these banks may be too big to act for actually the Icelandic central bank to save, to step in and save if trouble ensued. But they also became aware of the fact that the investments that the Icelandic banks had made, particularly in British and US real estate, were becoming distressed. And so what happened was, when British investors finally became sufficiently concerned about the possibility of repayment from the banks, they took their money and they ran. It was a classic run on the bank. These British investors sold their kronas and bought pounds. There was a gigantic mass exodus of wealth from Iceland back into Great Britain. So trend 2, the flow of money from Iceland to Britain, amplified. But trend 1, the flow of money from Great Britain into Iceland, disappeared or evaporated overnight. What happened was the banks experienced a bank run. The Icelandic government and central bank was too small to be able to stop it, and the ensuing bank run and banking collapse absolutely devastated the country. The krona fell dramatically in value, depreciated relative to the pound, and the domestic prices soared. Iceland was one of the first countries to experience the global financial crisis in the last part of 2007 and 2008. So the purpose of this particular lecture is to understand some of these trends from a supply and demand or economic standpoint. Within a year after the bank run, Iceland was essentially broke. The consumer debt was 8 times the national income. And because the krona had depreciated, it was becoming very difficult for Iceland to even contemplate paying back the foreign loans. The idea in this chapter, or the tools in this lecture, are going to allow us to understand what happened in Iceland from an economic perspective. So in the market for foreign exchange, one of the first key takeaway points from this lecture is that the supply of pounds includes everyone in Britain wanting to buy Icelandic goods. In order for a British individual or consumer to buy something from Iceland, they will need to sell their pounds and buy krona. The supply of pounds, therefore, is essentially equal to the demand for krona in the foreign exchange market. Where does the demand for pounds come from? Well, everyone in Iceland wanting to buy British goods needs to sell their krona and buy pounds. They need to convert their krona into pounds, and the demand for pounds is equal to the supply of krona. One of the things we saw in Iceland was the so-called carry trade, which refers to the idea of borrowing in a foreign currency and then spending that money, either domestically or abroad. For an individual who borrows in a foreign currency, say an Icelandic resident who borrows in British pounds and then spends that money domestically within Iceland, what that does is it increases the demand for the domestic currency. They have to sell their borrowed pounds and buy krona, and that increases the demand for the domestic currency, the krona in this case, which tends to appreciate the domestic currency. On the other hand, somebody engaged in the carry trade, borrowing foreign money, who then uses that, say, to buy imported goods or invest in a foreign country, that actually does not affect the exchange rates. In that case, it's like a round-trip transaction. The Icelandic resident borrows money in Britain, maybe very temporarily converts that into Icelandic krona, but then immediately converts it back into British pounds, say, to buy an imported good from Great Britain. The price of 1 British pound measured in krona is graphed on this particular exchange rate figure, and we can see over the period 2003 to 2009 that there was a significant change in the price of a British pound. In this case, the British pound appreciated substantially. The appreciation of the pound is equivalent to the devaluation or depreciation of the krona. We can also analyze the movements in the exchange rate by using supply and demand for krona instead of the supply and demand for pounds. So the supply of pounds, remember, those who sell pounds to buy krona, is also the demand for krona. And likewise, the demand for pounds, those who would sell krona to buy pounds, is also the supply of krona. So when the price of the krona or the pound is at 200 krona, as we see here in this illustration, we could also say that the price of the krona is half a penny. Again, the strengthening of or appreciation of the British pound illustrated in this time series is equivalent to the weakening of or depreciation of the krona. From a historical perspective, we can see that although there was a long-term trend in the exchange rate, the price of the British pound in terms of Icelandic krona, this graph goes back to 1982, we can see that that very rapid spike or appreciation in 2007 and 2008 is relatively unprecedented. There were no other periods of extreme volatility during this period, and so the event that we're considering here really is unique to what was happening in the 2003 to 2008 period. So to understand the impact of supply and demand on the pound-krona exchange rate, I'd like to consider this from a supply and demand standpoint or framework. And I'd like to look at the price of a British pound in terms of krona. We will use our standard supply and demand analysis, prices on the vertical axis. Here now we've got the price of a British pound in krona and the quantity on the horizontal axis. And let's start with an initial point of equilibrium, a downward sloping supply demand curve and an upward sloping supply curve. And let's ask, what happened, or how can we illustrate these two trends that we were talking about just a few moments ago? Remember, trend number one consisted of money flowing from Great Britain into Iceland. Money flowing from Britain to Iceland involved the selling of pounds and the buying of krona. In this particular graph, we're looking at the price of pounds, and so we're going to focus on the supply and demand of pounds, not the offsetting supply or demand of krona. So this trend number one involved selling pounds and buying krona. The focal point here is selling pounds. The selling of the pounds in the foreign exchange market increases the supply of pounds. And so trend one alone would cause an increase in the supply, so we'll call this from S1 to S2, and the price of a British pound would actually go down when expressed in krona. So this trend alone would lead to a depreciation of the British pound. And if this was the only trend that was taking place economically in this 2003 to 2006 period, we would have seen the pound depreciate. In fact, we saw a pretty flat line trend from 2003 to 2006. Not much changed. Now, one of the important reasons that we want to consider supply and demand analysis here is that if somebody looked at that price of the pound in terms of krona from 2003 to 2006 and saw that it was relatively flat, they might be tempted to conclude that not much was going on. Nothing could be further from the truth. One trend was taking place that had a pressure on the pound that was in a downward direction. But remember, there was a second offsetting trend, what we called trend 2. And this was a trend that involved the flow of money from Iceland, primarily back to Britain. So money was flowing from Iceland to Britain. Most of these Icelandic residents were using either their borrowed money or their newly found wealth to buy imported goods from Britain, and that required them to sell their krona and buy pounds. We're illustrating this supply and demand in terms of pounds, and so we're going to focus on the buying of pounds. The buying of pounds in the foreign exchange market can be modeled as an equivalent, or is equivalent to, an increase in the demand for pounds. So this demand curve is also going to shift outward when we model trend number 2, which I'll label D2. This buying of pounds increase the demand, and we can see that relative to, I'm going to call this point number 1, point number 2, and now point number 3, relative to point number 2, an increase in the demand for pounds will actually, in and of itself, lead to an appreciation of the pound. Now we can see that the net effect, layering trend 1 and trend 2 on top of our analysis, is that the overall price change from 1 to 2 to 3 is essentially unchanged. The quantity or the volume of trade in the foreign exchange market is actually much higher, and we did in fact see that during the 2003 to 2006 period, although that data wasn't included on any of the graphs we looked at a few moments ago. But the key idea here is that even though the price was relatively stable in the lead up to this financial crisis, it was not the case that nothing was going on. We had two very powerful forces at work, and these economic forces essentially offset one another. Now, when the foreign crisis occurred and the capital started flowing out of Iceland, trend 2 was amplified, but trend 1 essentially disappeared. And so we could illustrate that phenomenon by just removing trend 1 and focusing only on trend 2. So if we look at now the quantity and the price of the pound in terms of krona, and we think about our initial starting point, call that demand curve D1 and supply curve S1. When the banking crisis began or got underway, what we saw was that money was flowing only out of Iceland and into Great Britain. So during the crisis, we had only one direction of money flow, and that involved selling kronas and buying pounds. The buying pounds is illustrated or captured as an increase in demand, which we saw just a moment ago. But when that is the only force at work economically, we see that there is a dramatic increase in the price of the pound. In other words, a dramatic appreciation. So it was almost like the rug was pulled out from under the Icelanders' feet, and after the banking crisis got underway, trend 1 disappeared, trend 2 amplified, and that's when we saw a dramatic appreciation in the price of the British pound and the spike in the price on the graph that you saw a few slides ago. So this appreciation was the net result. Now, currency devaluations or depreciations are not all bad. There's a silver lining in every storm, and so a currency devaluation actually will help the suppliers in a particular country because it makes those exported goods less expensive in the foreign country. British customers could buy Icelandic exports relatively cheaply after the currency devaluation in Iceland. And so for Icelandic exporters, the devaluation was actually beneficial. However, it hurt consumers, and the reason it hurt consumers was that it made imports much more expensive in the domestic Icelandic Krona currency. So, from the Iceland consumer's point of view, the carry trade that we saw taking place involved Icelanders borrowing pounds, and then they used those borrowed pounds to invest domestically. One of the reasons that that happened was the cost of borrowing had increased so dramatically. Interest rates in Iceland in the run-up to the financial crisis were so much higher than they were in Great Britain. So Icelanders found a cheaper source of funds from banks in Great Britain. They borrowed in the foreign countries with those low interest rates, and then they took those borrowed pounds and converted them into krona. What that conversion of pounds to krona did, the selling of pounds and the buying of krona, was increase the supply of pounds in Iceland. And that was one of the initial trends. That was trend one, essentially, that we talked about, the carry trade and the movement of money from Great Britain to Iceland. That trend one would have the effect of depreciating the pound and appreciating the domestic currency. But the missing piece, the reason that didn't happen, the reason that the currency rate was essentially flat in the run-up to the banking crisis, was that Iceland's foreign borrowing was occurring at the same time that they were increasing their import consumption. So they were increasing foreign borrowing, but they were also consuming foreign goods. And to consume imports, the krona, or the Icelanders, had to sell their krona and buy pounds. So the exchange rates essentially didn't change because the demand for the pound was increasing at the same time the supply was increasing. But by the fall of 2008, after the run on the Icelandic banks, most investors sold their krona and bought pounds. So the demand for the pound dramatically increased, we saw, and that increase in the demand for the pound led to an increase in price for the pound, and the pound actually appreciated. So the missing piece there was that there was an offsetting trend, and these two offsetting trends, while they were both of equal magnitude economically, essentially led to no visible change in the exchange rate. It would have been wrong, though, to conclude that everything was fine and that nothing was happening. And one of the reasons that economic supply and demand analysis can be so helpful is it can help us to understand what we're seeing, or even what we're not seeing, in terms of the underlying economic trends. And as we saw then, when one of those trends disappeared and the second one became much stronger, there was a run on the bank. Many Icelandic investors and many British investors sold their krona to buy pounds. The demand for the pound increased, and the pound then appreciated, which we saw graphically in the dramatic rise in the price of the pound. I want to thank you for listening to this lecture on foreign exchange rates, how supply and demand analysis can help us to understand what we see or what we don't see in the foreign exchange market, and in particular what we saw in the run-up and the banking crisis in Iceland.